Hey, how's it going? This is Billy with Wolf River Music, and you are watching the Vinyl Review. Thank you for joining us here, and today we are at episode number 10. And sometimes here on this program, we might feature an artist or a band that you can consider to be maybe a little bit more on the obscure side of things. But today is not that day, because the featured band for this episode is the Rolling Stones. Hardly an obscure group, to say the least. But we're also talking about the Rolling Stones in the summer of 1965. And at this point, they are still a relatively new group. And while they are enjoying some early career success, they are not yet the international superstars that they would become within just a couple of years from this date. 1965 is turning out to be a very busy year for these young guys, with this album, Out of Our Heads, being the second release of the year for them, with still yet another one, which will follow only barely 4 months later in December of this same year. When this particular record right here was released in the United States on the 30th of July, 1965, Mick Jagger had just turned 22 years old. Keith Richards won't turn 22 until the end of 1965, and Brian Jones is 23. So, the founding members of the group are still very young men, but even so, by the middle of 65, they have toured the United States 3 times. They've played concerts in most of Northern Europe, as well as in Australia, New Zealand, and even Singapore. And depending on whether or not you're counting their UK releases or just the ones released in the United States, Out of Our Heads is more or less their 4th overall album of songs. They have achieved some moderate levels of success in the UK by this time, with 3 songs that have managed to crack the British top 10 singles charts, and are still working on raising the band's profile in the United States, where they're having a bit more difficulty in catching on. And just like the Beatles, they've also played on The Ed Sullivan Show. But unlike their friendly competitors in the other big band from Liverpool, they're not instantly winning over audiences in the United States, the same way the Fab Four had done going back to their own appearance on The Sullivan Show in February of 1964. There are several reasons for this, but in this episode, we're only going to be able to really just begin to examine those reasons and talk about what exactly was going on with them and why they seem to be having a much slower start to their own careers than the Beatles did. But this is a conversation that will probably have to spill into further episodes down the road a bit. Regardless of what has happened with the Stones up to this point in time, nothing could have really prepared them for the sudden success that they were just about to see, based almost entirely on a single song that they recorded in May of 1965, which initially didn't really seem to be all that special to the band or even to Keith Richards, who initially came up with the original guitar hook of the song. And yes, I am talking about the song Satisfaction. It has a compelling and a very interesting backstory attached to it, and we are going to devote a lot of time to talking about this song in particular. But before we do any of that, let's catch up with the band and talk about some of their early history, specifically some parts of their story that maybe we didn't quite cover enough in episode number 2, which was when we talked about the album The Rolling Stones Now. And if you saw that one, you will probably remember that the record got a somewhat favorable, but a very average grade of 7.3, which isn't terrible by any means. But one of the main issues that we had with that record was that the Rolling Stones were still not much more than a very typical British rhythm and blues cover band who were recording mostly American blues classics by other artists such as Chuck Berry, Willie Dixon, Wilson Pickett, Muddy Waters, and Buddy Holly, amongst several others in that same vein. Jagger and Richards have tried their hand at becoming a songwriting partnership, but only with a limited amount of early success. Brian Jones, on the other hand, shows either little or no interest at all in songwriting and seems to prefer only making contributions to the band with what he feels he's actually good at. And that is limited to guitar and slide guitar hooks, but also harmonica, as well as some other interesting African percussion instruments. And yes, we know that Brian also played the sitar and the organ and keyboards and the drums, auto harp, Japanese koto, vibraphone, dulcimer, marimba, and actually a total of 23 different musical instruments in the 7 years that he recorded with the Rolling Stones. But he is only just beginning this part of his musical journey by this point in 1965. So, maybe just try to chill a bit in the comments section about this part for now. That would be great. Thank you. Bassist Bill Wyman and drummer Charlie Watts are not asked nor expected to contribute at this point to really any of the early Rolling Stones repertoire of original songs. So what we're getting at here is that the Rolling Stones have not yet moved up and out of their early version of themselves as an R&B American blues cover band from London. The biggest question here is whether or not this album is going to turn out to be that big career turning point for them, or whether or not they're going to continue to act more like a cover band for just a little while longer while they're still in an early career learning phase. By the end of this episode, we're confident that we should have an answer for that. Most people who are at least somewhat familiar with this band that's been around now for over 60 years will immediately think of Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. And so naturally, it would seem to make sense to start off talking about them and how they initially got together. But Mick and Keith are not actually the beginning of this band. That would be Brian Jones. But he has been gone now from this earth since 1969. And that was a long, long time ago. Either way, it was actually Brian Jones who put the ad in the Soho, London area newspaper called the Jazz News as a way of recruiting musicians to come and audition with him to become new members of a musical group that Mr. Jones had in mind. In time, Mick and Keith saw that ad, and they replied to it in person. So we really have to give credit to Jones for basically being the initial catalyst for bringing the original lineup of the Stones together. And, at least in the very early days of this new group, it was also Brian Jones, who was the de facto leader and the self-appointed manager, as well as the most driven and the most motivated member to actually want to succeed in the music business. Now, his attitude changed rapidly over the course of the next few years after the founding of the group, and not necessarily for the better. But that is definitely the way it was in the very beginning. So, with all of that in mind, let's go ahead and start off with him and his part of the story. Louis Brian Hopkin Jones was born on the 28th of February, 1942, in the small but historically charming town of Cheltenham, which is well known as a spa resort town with many different annual music and literature festivals, some of them that date all the way back into the 17th century. Brian hated this town ever since his early childhood, and he couldn't wait to grow old enough to leave it and head off to London, where he could finally pursue his dreams of becoming a blues musician, just like his idols, Elmore James and Robert Johnson. His parents were of Welsh descent, and they were musically gifted people, but they were also extremely conservative and, according to Brian, puritanical Christians who were seemingly intolerant of anyone with ideas that differed from their own. This became an impossible situation for Brian, living at home, as he became a rebellious and a sexually active teenager who completely rejected the conservative and religious values of his parents. Brian was a big-time troublemaker at school, and by the age of 12, he had developed the peculiar habit of pouring the cafeteria milk out of his glass at lunchtime, and instead filling the glass with brown ale that he was known to steal from one of the local breweries in town. Brian had an extreme aversion to any and all authority figures over him, and he would often break rules just out of spite and out of a sense of some kind of misguided adventure. He was also one of those rare students who disrupted class constantly, but who also was somehow able to pass all of his exams with almost little or no effort to study for them, or to treat any of his grades or his classes with any sense of respect or importance. He was tested as having an IQ of around 135, which certainly isn't in the range of a Mensa or anything, but well above average nonetheless. But it wasn't really academics that Brian Jones was interested in, and what he showed a natural aptitude for at a very young age was music. He began on the piano at the age of 6, and by the age of 10, he had taught himself how to play the clarinet. And then, by the age of 13, he had taught himself how to play the saxophone. He soon discovered the jazz music of Charlie Parker and Cannonball Adderley, much to the horror and the utter dismay of his parents. By 14, he was already playing the alto sax with local bands in clubs that he could legally get into, considering his young age. By 15, he had impregnated a 14-year-old classmate, causing a massive scandal in his hometown and causing embarrassment and disgrace to his parents, who by this time had all but given up on trying to rein in their wayward son. And when the same thing happened again less than 3 years later, it was the last straw for them. And then that was it. He was headed to London on his own, and he made no effort at all from that point on to contact his parents ever again. Brian Jones was so eager to rid himself of the unhappy memories of his upbringing in his hometown of Cheltenham that after relocating himself to London, he temporarily changed his name to Elmo Lewis and adamantly refused to ever speak at all about where he was from, choosing to just completely avoid the topic altogether if ever asked about it. And this is where, in the spring of 1962, the newspaper ad that Brian Jones had placed in the Jazz News comes into play, and where Mick Jagger and Keith Richards will enter this story. And by the way, these three didn't really hit it off right away after their first meeting together, and the original lineup of this band came together more out of a series of random events rather than any kind of an immediate musical chemistry. Here's how it happened. After Brian Jones got to London, he soon found work at a department store in the Queensway area that sold electrical appliances. Brian then took the opportunity to begin pilfering money on a regular basis from the cash registers as a way to fund the purchases of cigarettes, beer, records, and possibly even a cheap guitar amplifier that he had recently spotted in a local music store window. He was able to get away with this for quite some time, and managed to steal not only enough money for lots of cigarettes and beer, but also for a lot of very stylish new clothes that began to become his trademark around the area where he lived and amongst the other musicians who he associated with. Well, eventually he did get caught raiding the till, of course, and he got the sack. But by that time, he was no longer interested in working in a retail shop, and he was hell-bent on the idea of becoming a working musician. By the time he had met up with Mick and Keith, neither of these two boys from Dartford were polished musicians in any way, and they didn't even answer the ad, thinking that they were going to get into any band with this older and much more experienced musician. And they were initially right. Brian was already playing regularly with several other experienced musicians, including keyboardist Ian Stewart and another much more accomplished lead guitarist named Jeff Bradford, who later went on to have his own mildly successful solo career. When Mick and Keith first went to meet up with Brian Jones in a pub on Berwick Street called the Bricklayer's Arms, they really just went there because all they wanted to do was to simply hang out and have beers with other musicians who they were in awe of. And in the very, very beginning, that's literally just about all that it was. Now, while Mick and Keith were definitely trying on their own, back in their own part of town, which was 12 miles away in the Sidcup area of southeast London, to become musicians that anyone would actually take seriously, at that time they were not in the same league, musically speaking, as Brian Jones or any of the other musicians that he was working with at that time in May of 1962. Jones and his musical friends looked down on the likes of Mick and Keith at that time because they were viewed as inexperienced youngsters who dressed like shabby vagrants and who also appeared to not even have enough money to eat properly. While Brian has his shiny new semi-professional Harmony Stratotone that he had somehow convinced a friend to buy for him, Keith, on the other hand, at that time, had a much less valuable and a much older Harmony Meteor guitar, the kind that most people at that time would consider to be what we think of as a pawn shop guitar, and definitely not a professional instrument. So this trio of musicians, including Jones, keyboardist Ian Stewart, and lead guitarist Jeff Bradford, well, they just allowed Mick and Keith to kind of sit in with them and play, but all the while not considering them to be musical equals with them. That is, until an argument ensued between Bradford and the others about playing cover songs that the more accomplished guitarist deemed to be beneath him. These songs included Roll Over Beethoven and Sweet Little 16 by Chuck Berry. Bradford considered himself to be strictly a blues purist, and he only wanted to play songs by artists the likes of Muddy Waters, etc. So in a huff, Bradford immediately quit the group. He left, and then he never came back. And so it was Keith Richards' position now as the second guitarist to Brian Jones, and Mick Jagger came with Keith Richards, more of like a package deal, as a vocalist. Then, with another friend from Sidcup, Dick Taylor on bass, well, this group, with no permanent drummer yet, was more or less formed out of default in June of 1962. They didn't even have a group name yet. The story behind that was that Brian Jones was on the phone with the owner of the Marquee Club in London, and Brian was making an attempt to land the group their first paid gig together. When the club owner simply asked Brian the name of the group, he was caught off guard and started to panic. Lying on the floor in the room, upside down, was the record The Best of Muddy Waters. So Brian immediately began to scan the song titles, and track 5 on side 1 is the song titled Rollin' Stone. So Brian told the man on the phone that the band was called the Rollin' Stones, without the G at the end, of course. So they were booked at the Marquee Club for July 12th, 1962, as the Rollin' Stones, which all the other members of the band disliked immediately, most likely because they were never even asked to weigh in on the issue of the band name in the first place. So anyway, this incident, while seemingly funny to us now, was actually the beginning of a very contentious behavioral pattern that Brian Jones would adopt in the early days of the band, i.e., naming the band without asking anyone else about it first, but also signing contracts as the de facto leader and manager of the band, negotiating payments and also negotiating higher payments for himself as the self-appointed manager of the group, etc., without bothering to consult with anyone else, or else just refusing to even discuss any information about where he was booking the band or how much they were even being paid. Brian Jones viewed himself as the leader, and as such, he regarded himself as the only one who was allowed to speak on behalf of the group or to collect payment for their services. This became a much bigger problem later as the gigs became more frequent and as the stakes grew higher. And this is also where we're going to leave this part of the story and move on to the record review. We have the Rolling Stones scheduled for a total of 22 different episodes in this video series, and so that leaves plenty of time left for the telling of their long history. We have much more to talk about with Mick Jagger's story and Keith Richards' story, and also about other members of the group who aren't even here yet, Bill Wyman and Charlie Watts. And Brian Jones, with all of the chaos he's about to start collecting in his own life, is just barely even getting started in his reign of terror within this group. Let's talk about this record. One thing right off the bat, there are 12 songs here, and 7 of them are originals written by Jagger and Richards, or they are songs that are credited to all of the Stones under the pseudonym of Nanker Phelge. And in case you're wondering what exactly that name is or what it means, when you see it in album liner notes, the name derived from an inside joke mainly amongst Jagger, Richards, and Jones. It makes reference to a really weird roommate that once shared a cheap apartment with these three in the London area of Chelsea, 102 Edith Grove to be exact. And he was known for being fond of wearing his underpants on his head. Now, there's no real explanation for that, but that guy's name was Jimmy Phelge. The Nanker was a grotesque and a contorted facial expression that Brian Jones was often known to make when he was drunk. Either way, the name was used as a way to credit all 5 of the Rolling Stones plus their manager, Andrew Loog Oldham, with writing credits. Have you seen enough of these yet? Because there's plenty of them and we can just keep going if you want to. Anyway, the good news is that it looks like the Stones are slowly beginning to move closer and closer to being an all-original band and relying less on the material from other writers. The bad news is that one of these Nanker Phelge compositions is truly awful and should have never been included on this record at all. I'll tell you which one it is in just a few minutes. But we always start off with the praise and the good parts first. The most celebrated and famous song on this record is obviously Satisfaction. In fact, you could argue that it's possibly the most famous song that ever even came out of the mid-1960s. And the only other songs that could be named as possible competition to that title might be Aretha Franklin's version of Respect, Like a Rolling Stone by Bob Dylan, California Dreamin' by the Mamas and the Papas, or possibly The House of the Rising Sun by the Animals. Satisfaction was a huge song and a massive hit for the Rolling Stones. It was their first #1 song in the United States and their 4th #1 in the UK. It also hit #1 in Australia, Germany, Ireland, Norway, and Sweden, just to name a few. It put them on the map and in the same league with the Beatles, really for the first time ever, because it proved that the Stones had finally broken through in America, even after they had already cemented their reputation in Europe. And the funniest thing about how this song proved to be so successful in the UK is due to the fact that it was actually banned on the commercial radio airwaves in their home country. The lyrics were considered to be just way too suggestive, with all sorts of sexual overtones and general lewdness that was just not socially acceptable back then, apparently. It was, however, being played by offshore pirate radio stations that were being broadcast from small boats out in the English Channel and in the North Sea. So yeah, I think we all know just how big of a hit song this was and how it's still even well known today, showing up in movies and films all the time, and how it's become more or less of an iconic piece of musical history that will still be remembered for decades, even beyond the one that we're in right now. But the question is, do we think over here that it's the best song on this record? Well, yes, actually we do. Not because of its ridiculous amount of commercial success necessarily, but mainly because it really just does stand head and shoulders above anything else that's on this album. It's so unique that it almost stands out like a sore thumb. The only other songs here that even come anywhere close to this one, in terms of social impact, creativity, or quality of songwriting, etc., would maybe be the songs The Last Time and The Spider and the Fly. And more good news, both of those songs that I just mentioned are originals written by Jagger and Richards. So again, they are at least moving in the right direction. Mostly. So, this simple little guitar riff here, which, as the story goes, Keith Richards got up out of bed one night, he grabbed an acoustic guitar, and he laid down this riff on a cheap little cassette tape recorder that he kept next to his bed. When he woke up the next morning and listened to it again, he said that it was actually less than 2 minutes of him playing some of these guitar parts and the chords, and the rest of the 30 minutes of tape were of him falling back asleep and snoring. He said that honestly, he didn't really think much of it and didn't think that it was really all that special. But a few weeks later, he showed the chords and the guitar part to Mick Jagger. And then Mick sat next to a hotel swimming pool in Clearwater, Florida, and wrote down all the lyrics. 4 days after that, the band were in Chicago, and they laid down an early demo version of this song at Chess Studios on the 10th of May, 1965. Richards had it in his own head that this guitar part wasn't even meant to be a guitar part at all, and that he envisioned it being played by a horn section. So he added a fuzz pedal to the recording, kind of similar to this one that I have right here. Not exactly the same one, but kind of similar. And he only did this as a way to mimic what he thought was the sound of trumpets. Mick and Keith, surprisingly, weren't really that excited about the prospects of this song, and they initially felt like it was just a throwaway. They did not agree that the song was ever meant to be released as an A-side single. So the band held a vote with everyone involved, including management. And Jagger and Richards were outvoted on a song that they had actually written themselves. So the song was released as a single on the 4th of June, 1965, with no trumpets and no horn section, by the way, and the guitar part with the fuzz box pedal was left as it was. And of course, the rest is history. The Gibson Company also greatly benefited from the release of this single in the way that it was, because as soon as everybody found out what Keith Richards had used in order to achieve that fuzzy, distorted guitar tone, well, the Maestro fuzz tone pedal completely sold like crazy until it was out of stock.
by the end of 1965. As far as we're concerned, we think the song is great mainly because it's just so bold, and for its time, it was perceived as being very disturbing and even threatening to the older generation and the status quo.
Which we happen to think is very cool, by the way.
Jagger is railing about not only being sexually frustrated and unsatisfied, but he's also calling out blatant commercialism and all of the useless information that was constantly being fed to him and to his own younger generation by the media in radio and television ads. Like I said, this is some pretty bold commentary for a rock song back in 1965. By our standards nowadays, based on everything else that we've heard since that time, this song might actually seem kind of quaint and maybe even a little bit dated, depending on what kind of music that you're used to listening to yourself. But when it came out, it was shocking and controversial, which is also why it became famous and why it sold so well. So, on to some of the other stuff. I also mentioned the songs The Last Time and The Spider and the Fly. With these two songs, we're starting to get a glimpse of where they're headed as a band. They still have a long way to go before we get to Sticky Fingers and Exile on Main Street, but you're just beginning to hear it on this record. The Last Time needs to be singled out as well because it's one of those very rare Stones songs that has them venturing a little bit into Beatles territory. If you listen close, you can hear it. Much has been said about just how much the Stones wanted to distance themselves away from the Beatles in terms of their clean-cut image, their matching suits, happy pop songs, etc. And I alluded to the idea earlier in this video that the Stones were not having an easy time breaking into the US in the same way the Beatles seem to have done so very quickly.
Well, that's a long story, but really what it comes down to mostly is just the differences in the way the members of these two bands looked, how they wore their hair, how they dressed.
The Stones were just not as cute as the Beatles were. They seemed a little bit more on the scruffy side, and the Stones had even longer hair than the guys in the Beatles did.
And while this seems kind of silly and maybe even a little bit trite in the year 2025, it really was a very significant factor for them back then, especially in the Midwest and in the deep South of the United States.
There were times, according to stories told by the various members of the Stones over the years, that claimed they were stopped from eating in certain restaurants in parts of the USA, and they were also denied entry into some hotels as well. They were run out of small towns by the police, even during times when the bus was just simply stopping to get gas. The Stones just had a certain look about them that made rednecks in places like Nebraska, Kentucky, Mississippi, whatever, feel uneasy and threatened. It was actually a thing with them, and that very first tour of the United States was in many ways considered a disaster for them, just due to how poorly they were treated in some parts of the country. Anyway, yeah, you can definitely hear some Beatles-like harmonies in this one, and some guitar work on here that sounds like it could have easily been played by George Harrison. At this point, The Stones needed to break into America in a bigger way, and maybe they felt like it was okay to sound kind of like the Beatles, even if it was only just a little bit and maybe just that one time. Well, it seems like it worked because the song hit number 1 in the UK and it reached number 9 on the US charts. So these are the high points on the record.
But what we think also needs to be pointed out here, in general, is just how advanced Charlie Watts was as a drummer.
You know, we're listening to a ton of music, and right now, obviously, the bulk of that listening is from this time period. And I'm here to tell you that Charlie Watts was a fantastic drummer, and he is clearly the best musician in this band in the year 1965. And please don't ever forget that. When other people try to point out to you that his drumming is all just bread and butter, not exciting, whatever, he's not flashy. He's just really, really good at this. Okay, so now for the obvious weak points. And there are a few.
Okay, so first off, unfortunately, the album has some weaker B-side filler material on it. The Sam Cooke cover of Good Times
is just a song that seems like it was too far over their heads. It was out of their wheelhouse at that time. They were trying to reinterpret a soul classic sung by the best soul singer of his own generation. And they turned this one into what sounds like an early version of what we later started calling blue-eyed soul. It's just kind of weak, and it's more of a pop song than real soul. It's kind of the same thing with the song Hitchhike, which of course was made famous by Marvin Gaye in 1962. This song was already silly to begin with, but here it's just even more silly, and it sounds like pop fluff. This is not a high point at all on this record. But the worst offender has to be, without a doubt, the last song on side 1, which is titled I'm All Right, credited to Nanker Felge, which of course is the whole band.
This is a poorly recorded live version of a song that honestly was not really much of a song to begin with anyway. It's really more the sound of a band on stage just vamping a chord progression to some meaningless words, and it just sounds really bad. I know that they had limited technical abilities back then to properly record anything live, but they just threw this on here for no good reason other than to simply fill up 2 minutes and 21 seconds. And no doubt this probably went over very well in an actual live situation, but not on vinyl. Sorry, it just didn't work.
And all in all, for every single solid song on this record, like Satisfaction and The Spider and the Fly, they seem to follow it up with something really weak, like Hitchhike and I'm All Right.
So the album is very inconsistent. It has flashes of brilliance, and then it just has some throwaway, half-assed numbers like those 2 that I had just previously mentioned, and then a couple of other ones that really are just kind of questionable at best.
So we gave this record a 7.3 out of 10, which is a C. And that is exactly what we gave their last record that we reviewed on this series. So unfortunately, what we're seeing here is the Stones are in more of a holding pattern in the middle of 1965. And while we're seeing improvement, what we're also seeing is that they just simply don't have enough of this brilliance to fill out an entire album of it just yet. They're making strides, and they're moving past the cover band material. And we're also finding that some of the material that they're choosing to cover just simply doesn't really suit them anymore anyway.
And so if we have to give a slight nod to one of these 2 records, that both got the exact same grade, well, then I guess we'll give a slight edge to the later one. But that's basically only because it has the song Satisfaction on it and because it has less cover songs in general. At least it's feeling like they're ready to make a big jump ahead. This record just had too much weak material that brought down whatever was good about it. What it's time for is for the Stones to develop their own distinctive sound. When we hear from them again, it will be at the end of this same year, and the album is called December's Children. So, is this going to be the one that finally puts them on an upward trajectory? Or will we have to wait until April of 1966 and the album Aftermath? Stay tuned and find out. And also, please stay tuned, because we have the Beatles coming back on the Vinyl Review once again. In the very next episode, we're going to review the album Help. And I think it's safe to say that this album was a big one. Of course it was. We've all heard of it, and only about 4.5 million people have actually bought the album over the years. So let's talk at length about that one next time. And until next time, you have been watching the Vinyl Review on the Memory Field Wolf River Music YouTube channel. Please subscribe to us if you can. We greatly appreciate that. And tell your friends about us. Other than that, have a great day. See you next time.